I was thinking about why we do what we do at family gatherings.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you have the drill. Someone pulls out the old photo albums, or your uncle tells that same story about the fishing trip for, like, the 50th time.
Yeah.
And we all kind of roll our eyes, but we listen.
Hmm.
It's like we have this built-in need to be reminded of who we are.
Well, it's not really a glitch. It's actually a survival mechanism. Psychologists call it narrative identity.
Narrative identity.
Yeah, basically, if you lose your memory of the past, you lose your ability to function in the present. You don't know who you are, so you don't know how to act. And that's true for individuals, for families, and for entire nations.
Which brings us to what we're unpacking for today's deep dive. We're looking at Psalm 105.
Right?
And at first glance, honestly, it kind of looks like a syllabus for a history class set to music. It's just a lot of names and places and events.
It is a history lesson, essentially. It's known as a historical psalm. But I think instead of a textbook, a better way to think of it is as a historical resume of God's faithfulness.
A resume. I like that.
Yeah, it tracks the story of Israel all the way from the promise to Abraham through all the drama with Joseph, the chaos of the Exodus, and right into the promised land.
So our mission today is to really unpack that resume. We're not just going to list the dates and battles. We need to get at the why. Why did the writer document this specific list of events? And I think more importantly for us, how does looking back at this ancient history help us move forward when our own lives feel so chaotic?
That is the key question. The text makes a really strong argument, I think. You can't trust God for your future if you have amnesia about your past.
So let's dive in. The text doesn't start with, once upon a time. It opens with this, I call it an aggressive call to action. Verses 1 through 7 are just packed with commands.
It is aggressive, isn't it? We tend to think of gratitude as this warm, passive feeling.
Right, something that just washes over you.
But here, it's a discipline. Look at the verbs. Give thanks, call upon his name, make known his deeds, sing unto him, talk ye of all his wondrous works. It feels so vocal. It's not think quietly about how nice God is. It's talk about it.
Exactly. It's fighting that natural amnesia we mentioned. If you're not actively talking about the good things, the wondrous works, you'll forget them. And there's a specific instruction in verse 4 that I think frames this whole thing.
What's that?
It says, seek the Lord in his strength. Seek his face evermore.
I love that. So it connects remembering to seeking.
Right. I mean, think about it in human terms. You don't seek help from a stranger you don't trust. Right.
No, of course not.
You seek help from someone who has a track record of showing up. The psalm is saying, look at the record, remember the marvels, and because of that, now you can seek his face.
And it specifically calls out the seed of Abraham and children of Jacob. It's like, hey, you specifically pay attention.
That's the premise. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. Everything that follows this whole history lesson is the evidence for that statement. It's the proof. Okay, so let's get into the evidence. The resume kicks off with what you might call the covenant and the wanderers. That's verses 8 through 15. And it's all anchored on this word covenant.
This is foundational. It talks about an everlasting covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in the ancient world, a covenant wasn't just a handshake. It was a life or death bond.
And it says, he commanded this word to 1,000 generations.
1,000 generations. That's basically forever.
Wow.
And it was a promise about the land of Canaan. But here's the fascinating context the psalm gives us. And it's something we forget because we know how the story ends.
What's that?
When this promise was made, they were not a mighty nation.
No, verse 12 is so specific. It says they were but a few men in number, yea, very few, and strangers in it.
Very few. The Hebrew there implies they were, easily countable. They were a small family camping in other people's backyards, nomads.
Verse 13 says they went from one nation to another, from one kingdom to another people. That just sounds incredibly vulnerable. No homeland, no army.
They were. In that era, if you didn't have a king or a walled city, you were prey. A local warlord could wipe you out in an afternoon. But then you look at verse 14.
He suffered no man to do them wrong. Yeah, he reproved kings for their sakes.
This is pointing back to those really tense moments in Genesis where Abraham and Isaac are in the courts of foreign kings like Pharaoh or Abimelech.
Super dangerous situations.
And the psalm quotes God saying, touch not mine anointed and do my prophets no harm.
Touch not mine anointed. We usually hear that phrase a bit differently today, don't we?
We do, unfortunately. But in its original context, it's basically God granting diplomatic immunity to this vulnerable family. He's the superpower saying, these people are with me, back off.
So we have the promise and we have the protection.
Okay.
But then the resume takes this huge turn. We get to verses 16 through 22, the Joseph story. And this is where the drama really kicks in.
It does.
Because if I'm following this resume, I expect the next line to be, and then they got the land and lived happily ever after.
Instead, we get a famine. Verse 16 says God called for a famine upon the land and break the whole staff of bread.
That's a terrifying image. Break the staff of bread. It's like the one thing holding you up just snaps.
It implies total reliance because all the natural resources failed. But before the famine even hit, God had already made a move. He sent a man before them, even Joseph,
Who was sold as a servant. Now, most of us know the Sunday school version of this story, the coat, the dreams.
Right.
But Psalm 105 focuses on the grit of it. It does not gloss over the suffering.
No, it zooms right in on the trauma. Listen to the physical detail in verse 18. Whose feet they hurt with fetters. He was laid in iron.
Laid in iron. I was looking at some of the notes on that translation. Some versions say it could be rendered, his soul entered into the iron.
That's such a profound difference, isn't it? It wasn't just that his ankles were chafed.
No.
The iron entered his soul. It implies this deep, crushing psychological weight. He was a prisoner of the state, totally forgotten. He's at the absolute bottom.
And then there's this mysterious phrase in verse 19 that I really wanted to unpack. It says, until the time that his word came, the word of the Lord tried him.
That is, in my opinion, one of the most important verses in the whole text for someone listening today.
What does that mean? How does a word try someone?
Well, think about Joseph's story. He had a word from God, right?
His dreams.
The dreams of greatness, of his family bowing to him, that was the promise. But his reality was chains. The trial is the gap between what God said would happen and what is actually happening.
So the promise itself becomes the test of like, yeah, you said I'd be a ruler, but I'm rotting in here?
Exactly. The delay tests you. It refines you. It burns away arrogance. If Joseph had become a ruler at 17, he might have been an unbearable tyrant. The word tried him means the promise was forging his character in the dark. He had to learn to trust the promise giver when everything looked impossible.
And then the reversal happens.
Yeah.
Fast. The text says the king sent and loosed him. Joseph goes from iron fetters to being the lord of his house and ruler of all his substance.
And look at the authority he got. Verse 22 says he was empowered to bind his princes at his pleasure and teach his senators wisdom.
I love that. The guy who was bound in fetters is now binding princes.
It's poetic justice. But look at that second part. Teach his senators wisdom. Where did he learn the wisdom to run an empire? He didn't go to a university.
He learned it in the iron.
Precisely. The hardship was the syllabus. You can't teach senators wisdom if you haven't learned resilience in the dark. The fetters were the preparation for the wisdom.
Wow. That is a huge insight. So Joseph saves his family. They move to Egypt, and things are great for a while.
For a while.
Then we get to part 4, the Exodus, verses 23 through 38.
Right. Israel enters Egypt, the land of Ham, and the text notes that God increased his people greatly and made them stronger than their enemies.
Which is usually a good thing, but in geopolitics, that makes you a threat.
It terrified the Egyptians. So verse 25 says God turned their heart to hate his people, to deal subtly with his servants.
It's interesting that it says God turned their heart.
It shows God's sovereignty over the whole situation. The Egyptians' hatred became the catalyst that pushed Israel out of the nest. If they'd been comfortable, they never would have left for the promised land.
So the oppression begins, and then God sends in the agents of change, Moses and Aaron. And here the psalm just gives us this highlight reel of the plagues. It's a systematic dismantling of a superpower.
It really is. It lists darkness first, waters to blood, fish dying. But my favorite detail is the frogs. It says, their land brought forth frogs in abundance in the chambers of their kings.
In the chambers of their kings. Why focus on the bedrooms?
It shows there was no escape. The rich and powerful can usually insulate themselves from disaster. The king is fine in his palace, but here, no. The judgment was everywhere. The frogs were in the royal bedsheets.
It's gross, but it's effective. Then we get flies, lice, hail, flaming fire. It describes their vines and fig trees being destroyed, locusts eating everything. It sounds like total economic and environmental collapse.
It was. And it all leads up to verse 36. He smote also all the firstborn in their land, the chief of all their strength.
That was the final blow. But here's the contrast that I find so incredible. You have Egypt in ruins, darkness, death. And then you have Israel leaving. Verse 37 says, he brought them forth also with silver and gold.
They didn't leave empty-handed. They left with the wealth of their oppressors. It was a massive transfer of wealth.
Let's catch this detail, because this feels like its own miracle.
Yeah.
And there was not one feeble person among their tribes.
Just think about that. A nation of slaves, overworked, malnourished, beaten down for generations. And on the night they leave, there isn't a single sick, lame, or weak person among them.
No one was left behind on a hospital bed.
Exactly. It's supernatural sustainment. God didn't just liberate them politically, he healed them physically for the journey ahead.
And Egypt's reaction, verse 38. Egypt was glad when they departed, for the fear of them fell upon them.
They were basically saying, please just go. Take the money and leave us alone. It's a complete power reversal.
So they're out of Egypt. Now they're in the wilderness. Verses 39 to 45. And the theme seems to shift here from deliverance to provision.
Yes, because the wilderness is a scary, empty place, no grocery stores. But the psalm details how God just suspended the laws of nature to care for them. He spread a cloud for a covering.
Which is basically supernatural air conditioning.
And fire to give light at night, street lights. And when they were hungry, the people asked, and he brought quails and satisfied them with the bread of heaven.
And the water issue, that's the one that always gets me.
He opened the rock, and the waters gushed out. And notice the scale of it. They ran in the dry places like a river, not a trickle, a river in the desert.
So why did he do all this? Was it just because they complained loud enough?
The psalm is very clear about the why. Verse 42, for he remembered his holy promise and Abraham his servant. It all goes back to the covenant.
Back to the beginning.
God's faithfulness is anchored in his own word, not in the people's performance. He made a promise, and he kept it.
But the goal wasn't just to have a well-fed camping trip. Verse 44 says, he gave them the lands for a specific purpose.
That they might observe his statutes and keep his laws.
So the deliverance had a destination.
Precisely. They were saved for something. They were given the land so they could create a society that reflected God's character, one of justice and mercy and order.
So we've unpacked the resume. We've seen the wandering, the prisoner prince, the plagues, the wilderness. It's an incredible story, but we need to pivot. Why should someone listening today driving to work care about frogs in Egypt or water from a rock?
When you really digest this text, there are these key themes that bridge that gap. And the first one is simply, remembering history strengthens faith.
The idea that if he did it before, he can do it again.
Right. If you only look at your current crisis, your current famine or prison, you'll panic. It looks hopeless. But if you look back at the track record, you see a pattern. It's like weaponizing memory against anxiety.
I love that. Weaponizing memory. Another theme here is personal resilience, what you could call the Joseph principle.
I think this is so relevant for anyone feeling stuck. Maybe you feel like you were sold up by a partner, or you're stuck in a career prison, or dealing with a health issue that feels like fetters.
The natural reaction is to think God has forgotten you.
But the Joseph story flips that script. It says, no, the word is trying you. The fetters and iron often come before the ability to teach senators wisdom. The suffering isn't meaningless, it's training.
That reframe changes everything. It turns suffering into preparation.
Exactly. It gives you the endurance to wait for the time that his word came.
Then there's trust and uncertainty from the wilderness part.
We all go through wilderness experiences, times of transition, or just waiting. And the modern world hates waiting. We want instant answers.
And 5-year plans.
But the wilderness story shows that provision often comes just in time. Manna didn't fall a month in advance, it fell day by day. It teaches us to trust for today. It reminds us that even in barren places, God can make a river flow.
So if you're staring at a rock, a dead end, remember that rocks can hold rivers.
That's a lesson.
There's also a note here about social justice. We talked about God as deliverer.
Yes, the Exodus story is the ultimate liberation narrative. It shows God is not indifferent to oppression. He hears the enslaved. So for us today, advocating for dignity and justice is actually a way of reflecting God's character.
And finally, we have to circle back to where we started. Gratitude as a discipline.
The psalm opens with sing, talk, make known. It's active. We're wired to focus on the problems, right? The flat tire, the rude email. The application is to intentionally practice Thanksgiving.
Like actually speak it out loud.
Yes. Share stories of perseverance. Celebrate the small wins. Tell people how you got through the last tough season. It rewrites your internal narrative from one of victimhood to one of deliverance.
It's like we need to write our own historical psalm.
I actually recommend people do that. Literally write down the resume of your life with God. When were you few in number? When were you laid in iron? And when did the water gush out? When you see it on paper, a pattern emerges. And the pattern is faithfulness.
So as we wrap this up, Psalm 105 is really asking us to look back in order to move forward.
That's the core message. When we see the pattern, the covenant that holds, the trials that forge character, the deliverance that breaks chains, we realize God is steadfast. He hasn't changed.
And it suggests that whatever wilderness or trial you, the listener, are in right now, it might just be verse 18 of your story. You're in the laid in iron phase.
But the teaching senator's wisdom phase is coming. It's all part of a larger story of deliverance that you will one day tell with joy. The story isn't over yet.
That is a hopeful place to land. So here's the question we want to leave you with today. How can this history, this resume of faithfulness, strengthen your personal trust and your relationship with God right now?
And practically, how will you apply this information in your life? Maybe it's time to start writing that resume.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll catch you next time.